The new Canadian government is taking shape, and Prime Minister Mark Carney is promising to, in his words, deliver the change that Canadians want, and that includes addressing a housing affordability crisis. Prime Minister Carney has an ambitious plan, including dramatically increasing housing supply using public land and prefabricated homes. But my next guest says putting that plan to action will be challenging, to say the least. TD senior economist Francis Fong joins us now to break it all down. Lovely to see you.
Always a pleasure to be here again.
Okay, so let's start things off. He said that he wants to increase housing completions to 500,000 units per year. How feasible is that, and what does that mean?
Yeah, let's put some context around that first of all. Canada has only ever, at its absolute highest watermark, completed about 260,000 units in a single year, and that was back in the mid-70s.
Wow.
On average, we're about 210 or so over the last 5 years. A little bit less if you look at a 10-year average. So we're nowhere near 500,000. But what Carney has proposed is all of these different measures on both the demand side and the supply side that notionally would take that sort of normal 210,000 that we're used to in the private sector in terms of completions, and then adding on top of that. The biggest one is obviously this whole idea of Build Canada Homes, is taking public lands, setting up a government agency that would then get in the business of building homes itself. So notionally that would add net on top of that. But, if we dive into the details, or at least the details they've talked about so far, it is going to be a very difficult lift to set this agency up and figure out where you're going to build all of these sort of net new homes and whether people are actually going to be interested in those homes once they're built.
Let's talk about some of the things, because what I appreciate, though, is that, someone's looked at and said, okay, there's a system, here's the bottlenecks, and let's kind of see where we can alleviate those bottlenecks along the way. Public land, you mentioned, prefabricated homes, which is different, but maybe just talk to me a bit about what the proposal is at a high level and where you see some potential issues.
Yeah, definitely. So let's start with the demand side. He's proposed things like cutting the GST on new home sales. He's talked about something called the multi-unit residential building framework, which is sort of, if you're familiar with flow-through shares for the junior mining sector, very similar kind of situation where they're allowing real estate investors for purpose-built rentals to sort of deduct expenses off of their own personal income taxes by investing in these projects, and Build Canada Homes, and all of these different kinds of things. So, the way it's going to be is that they're going to try to hit the housing market from every possible side they can, and it's how it all works. Remains to be seen. I think there's going to be a lot of different sort of moving parts. But one of the things that I think is going to be really important for this government to figure out is how do you collaborate with your provincial and municipal counterparts to actually get housing built? Because this has always been our challenge. Every time we have an election, whether it's federal, provincial, municipal, we have governments that make big promises, but at the end of the day, all of the policy files that we're interested in sort of finding or moving the dial on or finding solutions for are multi-jurisdictional. You have some areas that are in the federal, you have some areas that are in provincial, and you have some areas that are municipal. So, how are we going to build housing if the government agency has to deal with the same kind of long timelines, big development charges that the private sector builders have to face? How are they going to figure that out? There's already a huge market of builders that navigate this system at the municipal and provincial level, and now you're going to start throwing in the federal government on top of that, and they don't really have a lot of experience, or at least they've lost a lot of the experience they did have at one point. And meanwhile, you still have your provincial bodies that are dealing with zoning and figuring out where to build the right homes. You have municipalities trying to figure out what their housing strategies are, how they want their sort of subdivisions to look. How do we build infrastructure to support all these new homes? There's so many questions that are sort of remaining that it's going to be a difficult challenge for this government for sure.
All right, let's dig into some of these though.
Sure.
Land, which is often the biggest cost in home building. There's the idea that he might lean on public lands, releasing those and making them available, or maybe not releasing them, but maybe you can tell me the mechanics of what we know so far.
For sure. So this is not new ground per se. In fact, Trudeau also talked about building on public lands, though he sort of never got around to it as part of the National Housing Strategy. There were a lot of points to that were already being done. Public lands was announced and just never got around to it. But it's been announced by Trump himself, wants to build on public lands. It's already being done in many places in Europe. So it's not necessarily new. The challenge here, though, is that most of the public lands are going to be in far-flung places that people don't necessarily want to live. The amount of public land in major metropolitan centers is going to be relatively limited and will be reserved for things like military colleges, national park systems.
Which we've seen some of those released in Toronto, I was just going to say.
Absolutely. So you're sort of taking land that's already in use, and are you going to repurpose that and build housing? If so, how many units can you feasibly get on these things? Are we going to lose green space? Is there a lot of surplus land for government buildings, administrative buildings, things of that nature that you no longer need and you can redevelop? It's not as if we just have land lying around that is not in use that we can just notionally build on. Maybe there's some of it.
Yeah.
So, estimates around how much public land is available for development like this is limited. Unfortunately, information is limited because we don't have a good sense of how all of this stuff is getting used and how much is actually out there. That being said, it does represent a significant opportunity because even though in Canada we've talked about it, we haven't yet done it. We have seen some success in places like Europe in launching this kind of initiative.
And how do they do it?
So this is the thing. Some jurisdictions, I would suggest, do it better than others, because at the end of the day, the problem here is the price of land. The price of land is incredibly expensive, and if you were to fold that price of land into any home you build, that's still going to be unaffordable for your average Canadian household, certainly your first-time home buyer. So how do you sort of take that out of the equation? Well, some jurisdictions, like the Netherlands, essentially do leased lands, where they're not actually selling it into the market. They're essentially providing this extremely long-term lease, maybe in perpetuity, to say, so long as somebody is building on that land and someone occupies that land, it's free for you to use. But the instant it is no longer occupied or no longer in use, it goes back to the public purse. So in that way, the cost of that home or buying that home is really just the rest of it.
Right.
Construction, labor, whatever profit margin that is taken by the builder, and then development charges for the municipality to build things like infrastructure to support that housing. So that does do it. We haven't really heard a lot of details about whether they're going to pursue something like that, but that would certainly be something that we would look for.
Let's talk about, you mentioned land. Now let's talk about the other, so to speak, bottlenecks or what's needed. Development charges.
Yeah.
What is a development charge for those who aren't in the industry?
Yeah, so it's essentially charges that the municipalities will put on the builders, which ultimately get passed on to the consumers, the actual end user. And essentially it's there to pay for things like roads, sewage, water, electricity, green space, schools, police, everything that municipalities are accountable for to ensure that the amenities that come with new subdivisions are there.
Financed.
Exactly, are financed. And the problem is, fundamentally, municipalities have very, very few revenue tools to be able to pay for those things. There's no income taxes at the municipality level here in Canada.
Property taxes.
Property taxes. So we have things like property taxes and development charges that are primarily there to pay for these things, but it's one time only. So you have this huge one-time cost that gets passed on to builders, and it's estimated that can be upwards of 25% of the cost of a home, mainly because things like sewage and water and all those other things are very, very expensive to do. So one of the things that Carney has proposed is basically splitting the cost of development charges between the federal government and the municipality. So they'll chip in some of that cost. And so that should notionally, again, sort of push the cost from the end user onto the federal government. Has to land somewhere, but it's essentially that's the model they're looking towards. But it's still going to be a big, difficult sort of lift to sort of figure out the timeline of how do we negotiate, we want to build here. Does it fit with how the municipality wants the city to look? Like, do they actually want housing here? Because they have to approve that kind of stuff. So the lengthy timelines that builders will often complain of, even if you sort of half the development charge, there's still the sort of time value of money question that's there as well. And that's not really answered, unfortunately, yet.
Okay. Labor. You said that at our peak, 270,000, I think, housing starts or completions in the 70s. Do we have the people to build 500,000 housing completions now?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question because, like, the sort of construction sector is not the same today as it was in 1974 when we hit that high watermark, obviously. And so, construction labor is something that we are in dire need of, and it's already an elevated share of our total labor force because we have so many things we need to build, not just housing, but also infrastructure, industry, and all those good things. So the reality is that to be able to meet a significantly higher level of construction. I mean, like we talked at the start about this 500,000 target that Carney set. We don't even think it needs to get there. Like our view is that even if we got to 400,000, which is still a heavy lift, would be enough to bring affordability back to at least the pre-pandemic level before we saw this huge spike in affordability as a result of everyone staying home. But even to reach 400,000, we'd need to double or triple the growth rate of the construction labor force here in this country, which, if you sort of think about the kind of barriers or challenges that the sector.
Yeah, I was going to say, are there any innovations though? And like when you think about prefab, you think about those things, are they less labor dependent? I mean, this comes back to productivity in Canada and all that good stuff. But is there any innovation that makes that better?
Definitely. I mean, if we did see prefab homes really launch, people were just like, this is something that I love.
Yeah.
Then yes, notionally we would need less labor if we did see a rising proportion of prefab homes. In fact, we already have prefab homes here in Canada. It was part of Trudeau's national housing strategy to build a lot of housing for marginalized populations. So women's shelters, recent newcomers, the unhoused population, all sorts of different kind of housing need, the sort of spectrum of housing need was being met by prefab homes. What is not clear is whether your average consumer is going to be interested in a prefab home, where prefab homes already are not part of the sort of notional housing system.
Right. What are you used to? What do you like?
Exactly. And that's sort of the kind of housing that we already have. That sort of sets the standard for what people expect to see. And would they be comfortable with prefab homes in place of that? We're not exactly sure yet.
I've seen some beautiful ones out there. I was just telling you before, I've seen some gorgeous things that are being made. But anyway, I think that just depends on personal taste and what you like. I want to talk a bit about, for those who are older, and they probably have this internal conflict where, my house is my retirement plan or part of it, and my children, though, still need a home at the same time. How do I, that's hard, right? Because you need to make sure that your house is still worth something, but at the same time, I want to make sure my kids have a place to go.
Yeah, I think this is sort of a major challenge for Canada in particular, and other jurisdictions like Australia or the Netherlands and places like that, where housing has just become a very significant portion of the assets held by a lot of Canadian households, or your average Canadian household, where a significant portion of what you have to retire on is going to be in your home, and you anticipate to consume from that. So to the extent that rising affordability means falling home prices, that's going to be, we have this really big problem of split incentives where you have an older population, to your point, where they may have children and they may have helped their children buy homes, but for those that haven't done that yet, and, maybe they want home prices to fall, but then they still want them to remain high so they can retire on that. We wrote a paper recently about the degree to which home ownership sort of perpetuates on itself, and that the homeowners that have seen their assets appreciate over time are more likely to help their children sort of get into that home ownership space.
Yeah.
And then they, of course, also benefit. So it's really the people that are really crying out for an increased level of affordability are the people that don't have that benefit of parents that are able to support them in their home ownership journey and are not yet homeowners themselves. And so there's all these different incentives from all these different groups. And we've already heard from the new housing minister, Gregory Robertson, that he's not necessarily interested in seeing home prices decline. And I think that was taken very negatively by a lot of folks because they presume that that's what's required, which leads me to believe that we will see an increased focus on Build Canada homes and making sure that whatever homes we build, they could potentially be below market specifically for that purpose.
I've only got about 30 seconds, Francis, but let me ask you just quickly, what do you need to see to make this successful?
The first foremost, we need to see federal, provincial, and municipalities at the table. Without that, it's just, you can't have unilateral action in the sector, unfortunately. We would love to see a federal government just sort of come in, build homes, and do all that good stuff, but that's first and foremost.
And are the provinces and the municipalities properly incented in a plan like this to be part of it?
And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of sort of divergent incentives in that regard. Everyone has a different sort of group that they're interested in supporting. to find alignment on that is naturally going to be very difficult. But beyond that, all the pieces need to fall into place. We need the financing, we need the land, we need the right policies in place, and we need the buyers to sort of get used to all these new prefab homes that could potentially come on market.